A while ago I got tired of all the manual calculations that I had to do in my calculator app whenever I had to eat something, especially considering the extra calculations that I had to do now that I needed to take 2 doses of insulin per meal instead of just 1. Therefore I decided to make an Android app in Github to make calculating insulin doses for meals way quicker. I originally made the app just for myself, but I realized that I could upload it online as it could potentially be useful for other people too. The rest of this video will explain the app's features, how it is used, and how to install it. As a quick showcase of how the app works, you're able to add food items to your calculation, where you can specify how much of that food you have. In this case, let's say 317 grams. Note that the unit can be whatever you want: weight, volume, count, or any other type of unit. More about this in the in-depth section of this video. You can then specify a multiplier for what percentage of carbs that food contains. Since this will be rice, I will set the multiplier to 25%, which in decimal form would be 0.25. You can also make your own presets for different foods, so that you don't have to fill in the multiplier every time. Tapping the use button will create an item in the calculation of that certain type, where you can see the item with a custom color and name. You can now specify how much of this item you have. If you go back to the types menu, you can also favorite certain types that you use especially frequently, which will make them appear in the main calculation menu in this bar, where you can tap on it to instantly add an item of that type in the calculation. The app will calculate how many units of insulin you need for all the items that are in the calculation. You can also offset the final amount with these buttons. This isn't particularly useful when you just need 1 dose of insulin per meal. However, it is a very useful tool when you need to take 2 doses per meal. If you decide to use 2 doses, you will realize that the calculated amount of insulin that you need will be divided in half into these 2 results. Since you can usually only take a whole number's worth of insulin, you will in this case have to decide which of the 2 doses you're going to round up and which one you're going to round down. By changing the offsets, you can now make it so that you don't have to remember which option you chose once you have to take your second dose, where you can just simply look at the second calculated value without having to do a bunch of extra thinking. When using 2 doses, this button will also appear on all the items in the calculation. Tapping this button will make all the carbs of that item jump over to the second dose without affecting the first one, which can be very useful in some scenarios. More on this in the in-depth section of the video. Finally, tapping on the checkmark button will save your calculation to your history, in case you want to access it in the future, for when you for instance are unsure of what multiplier you used for a specific food item that you happen to eat again, or for when you are eating the same meal as previously and want to quickly add all of those types to your calculation. Value inputs are done with these buttons. This button adds a blank item and this button deletes the selected item. To select a different item, you use these arrows, where you can use this button to switch which side of the item you want to change. The right side is for the amount of that item you want, whilst the left side is for specifying the multiplier of that item. For types that you've already created, the multiplier is already specified, which is why you always start out highlighting the right side whenever you create a new item. You're able to see how many carbs a specific item has here, and the total amount of carbs that the whole calculation has here. This button saves the current calculation to history, which saves all the items and thus total amount of carbs that the calculation contains. This button brings you to the menu where you can access the history and also change your settings, which are how many carbs you need for 1 unit of insulin and how many doses you want to be calculated. In the history menu, you will be able to see all the items that you had previously calculated, where each item's name, multiplier and amount is shown. If an item has this arrow at the end, it indicates that the button used to make the item's carbs count carry over to the second dose without affecting the first one was used. This button brings you to the list of all the types that you've created. If you want to create a new type, you can tap this button, which will allow you to select a color for the type with this janky stretched out color picker, give the type a name and specify its multiplier. Since the multiplier can be whatever number you want, that means that you can use whatever unit you want. Since I use grams for the majority of the time, I don't specify that in the food's name. However, if you're going to use a different unit from what you usually use, I would recommend specifying the unit in the type's name to make it clear what amount you should input when using that type in your calculations. I could for instance make a type called apple that has a multiplier of 0.12. This will use my most common unit, which is grams, meaning that I won't add anything to the name. I can now use this type whenever I have a kitchen scale available to weigh my apples. However, what if I don't have a scale available? I could then make a new type for apples, but instead of being in grams, I could make it per piece. I can then take the average amount of total carbs in an apple and set that as the multiplier for the type. I will also add the following text to the name to make it clear for me whenever I use this type that this is per piece and not per gram. Now whenever I use this type, instead of inputting how much it weighs, I will instead input how many apples I have. I could also make a type for the amount of carbs in a deciliter that apples have if I wanted to. You can use whatever unit you want. Kilograms, liters, amount of atoms, and even schmengels and prongles, or whatever you Americans use. It can sometimes be very annoying whenever you eat meals where you can't calculate exactly how much you will eat in advance, which means that you can't evenly split the 2 doses 50-50. The ability to make an item only count for the second dose and not the first one helps a lot in this regard. Let's say I'm going to eat crepes, but where I don't yet know how much topping that I am going to use. I know that I'm going to eat 300 grams of crepes, which I can input and split evenly between the 2 doses. I will now have to take my first dose of insulin. However, before doing that, I will add an offset to the doses. That is an estimate of how many units extra I will have to take from the topping that I can't calculate yet. This estimate I will add to the first dose and subtract to the second dose. Now I can take my first dose of insulin, where I then continue to eat whilst keeping track of how much topping I use. For all the items that I add after already taking my first dose, I will toggle the button that makes them only count for the second dose. Once I'm finished, if I'd made a good estimate previously, the first dose and the second dose should be pretty similar in size, where I will then take the second dose of insulin whenever appropriate. By doing this, you're able to get 2 way more evenly divided doses of insulin for a meal, despite not being able to calculate the whole meal before having to take your first dose. This project was originally just made for me to use, however later on I realized that I could upload it online for others to also use, since that required me to do extra unexpected coding to make the app compatible with different devices, and to make this video, whilst I was already pretty burnt out with the project, I have negative energy left to figure out how to publish it to an actual app store. Therefore you will have to download the APK directly from Github. However, this shouldn't be very hard, as you just have to do a few extra taps. On your Android phone, go to the Github project linked in the description of this video. Here you will find both the source code and also the installer for the app. Tap the file called simpleandhandyinsulintool.apk and then tap the download button. If you now go into your files, you should be able to find the APK that you just downloaded. Open it and install it. You should now have the app installed on your phone. You might wonder, why is the installed app 100 megabytes in size? Shouldn't the file size be extremely small considering how few assets there are? That is a very good question. I want to know the answer to that too.